So now that we've reviewed all of the derivative data sets that we got from operationalizing our crawling data, let's go into an example of like some really complex adversary that we can leverage these data sets to our advantage. So we're going to start with rss.nbcpost.com.
And can you give some background about this, like what happened with this attack?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting about rssnbcpost.com is, one, we know it's malicious, and that it was actually associated with some Russian espionage activity that had went on for about a year and a half, close to 2 years. And essentially what these guys were doing was compromising a number of web pages and then injecting scripts inside of them that would then profile users who visited these legitimate web pages in order to identify the technologies that they were running so that they could then ultimately deliver some exploits to them. So this infrastructure was fairly complicated, and it was something that grew over time. The rss.nbcpost.com was actually the second command and control that we observed being used by this malicious actor. So, firing this into community.riskiq.com, we can see that it appears to be active as of today. It's resolving to one IP address. Our time bar indicates that the infrastructure has been around since 2016. We do notice an observed gap here where I could just tell you, for the sake of the demonstration, this infrastructure was actually taken over by a researcher. It was sinkholed is what we would call it, where the infrastructure is basically taken over by good guys, and then instead of delivering malicious content or doing something nefarious, it's then parked on a web page, and those who have been compromised, the operator of the sinkhole can reach out to them. So again, keeping the traditional data sets out of it, there's definitely avenues that we could explore here. We naturally see some passive DNS information, some whois, subdomains, etc. But what I really want to focus in on is the host pairs, maybe the components, the trackers, and the cookies, the things that we get from our web crawling and virtual users. So if we start with the host pairs section here, what we can see is a pretty interesting pattern. One, we know that rss.nbcpost.com is bad. And so what I'm seeing here is a number of parent relationships to these other web pages, which have been marked as non-malicious and have a number of tags inside of them.
So that means that these parents are sending data to rss.nbcpost.com.
Yeah, there's that these sites are making some sort of reference.
And what we've done here is we've tagged these already to say if they were malicious or non-malicious and what type of, it was an embassy or government site. So that's why we're seeing some of these tags here. Because if someone does this on their own, they're not going to see that. But we've gone through and during our investigation have tagged these.
Yeah, that's correct. And as an analyst myself, I strongly recommend doing that technique simply because the capcorporation.org, where I may be familiar with it, or the Zambian embassy, I know that's obviously an embassy, but you get into cases where like you have this Bewaskofen.at where I'm not certain what that is. Right. And so I actually had to do some research there to identify that it was an agricultural based government website. And so putting those tags in place and then marking the website as non-malicious is really helpful just to help understand all of the different sites you're looking at. So what's particularly interesting here is we have all these websites, legitimate, non-malicious, reaching out through a script source to our rssnbcpost.com. Right away, my default inclination as an analyst is to believe that these websites are probably compromised. Now, naturally, I know the background information here, and so I'm familiar that, in fact, these sites were compromised, but that doesn't change the data and what the story tells us there. We can see that these websites have the relationship to our bad website. So if I pick one of these, let's say www.nambian.embassyusa.org, and I do a pivot on that, again, kind of using our visuals that are present for us, we see that there's activity associated with the infrastructure. It's been around for close to...
Since 2009.
Yeah, so nearly 10 years of activity here. And again, focusing not on the traditional data sets, which are actually not going to net us much value here, simply because unless the website was changed to point to something different, right, the infrastructure is going to be okay, the whois information is going to be fine, the subdomain should be good. Where I again want to focus is on those crawling data sets. And in particular, I want to look at the tracker tab. So what we're seeing here is one tracker that's been deployed on this web page, and it's a clicky ID. Now, clicky ID, like clicky itself, is just kind of a analytics-based service that doesn't mean too much to me. But what does pique my interest is the fact that it is around the same time of when those host pairs were being observed that we found that clicky ID, and it's the only tracker on here. So from an analyst perspective, I want to go investigate what that is. And so if I pivot on that clicky ID value, I then get a whole bunch of other websites that are associated, some of them being overlapped with what we saw with the host pairs.
Oh, there's a Russian embassy.
So there's a Russian embassy, there's that CAP Corporation again, we got mfa.gov.kg. We have some websites that appear to be legitimate here as well. But what's interesting here is we got a clicky ID that is now referencing some of the same websites that we know we're making a JavaScript reference to something that we know is malicious. So while I'm hesitant to say, but it does appear like this clicky ID, because of the overlap, the Russian embassy and CAP Corporation probably don't have a direct relationship between them, or all these websites for that matter. They don't seem to have a common theme other than the fact that they appeared in some of our host pair information, which we know that they're probably compromised. So this to me is saying that maybe the attacker has used this clicky ID as a means to track their users. So if I go over to this, the RussianEmbassy.org website, again, similar pattern, live web information in the past 6 months, several years of history through the time bar, probably legitimate information. Knowing that this particular website was referencing that clicky ID, I want to look at the trackers here too. Is there anything else that we missed? And in fact, we got some Twitter IDs, we got some Facebook information. To me, what's interesting is the Google account and account information, the Google tracking IDs here. And so, again, using some of my guilty knowledge, we have a case where there's a Google account number up top and a tracking ID that was procured around roughly the same periods of time, but there's two different values here. So if I were to go and tease these out a bit more, if I went and explored the top ones, I'm going to end up with a bunch of other, the Russian infrastructure-based website, the legitimate stuff. However, if I explore some of these bottom ones, this tracker, I end up with, again, a bunch of overlap. So again, a mixture here between legitimate web pages, some security-based websites.
Jordan Embassy now.
Yeah, we have the Jordan Embassy. We have some FrenchAmerican.org, visa obtainers, AfghanEmbassy.tj. So what's interesting here is we have some overlap between this Google Analytics ID that may be actor controlled. It's not entirely clear. It certainly seems to point towards, at the very least, that if they're not actor controlled, that maybe there's a single hosting provider providing this Google Analytics service and centralizing it for all the properties. But that would be kind of strange. So if we go back over to our RSSNBCpost.com, we now know that we got a bunch of infrastructure that appears to be compromised, that there's a JavaScript reference in place, that there seemingly appears to be some tracker information that's overlapping between them, and that we have some themes here, some government entities, some embassy, some nonprofits, some agricultural-based websites. Interesting kind of people to target. One of the other tabs that we didn't necessarily explore was the cookies tab.
And this is the new data set that we have.
Yeah, this is relatively new in terms of our crawling data sets. And in fact, one of the reasons why we added the cookie data set was because of this original example. And one of the things that we observed in our crawler data set was there was a PNP sesh ID cookie being deployed.
I've heard of a PHP sesh ID.
Yeah. So it's funny, if you actually go and explore the rest of this infrastructure, the application or framework that they're using in some cases is deploying a PHP sesh ID cookie, which is legitimate. But to me, I know that this website's bad, and I know that PNP sesh ID seems weird. And so if I pivot on that cookie name, I now end up with 28 websites, a lot of them being legitimate, and then a couple other ones that are sticking out as interesting to me. So we can see here right up top that in our immediate results, we don't see our RSSNBCpost.com. That's on the next page. But what strikes me as interesting is I have a bunch of other domains that are deploying this same unique cookie to websites that have also appear to have been compromised and are referencing our rssnbcpost.com.
And the time period that they're up is only a few days. Some of them, like the first one, the static travelclose.org, is only up for 3 days.
Yeah, which is interesting. So maybe we didn't observe it that often. But to me, what's interesting here is we got a 2015 time frame, 2015, and now I'm seeing 2017. Mm-hmm. So I mean, maybe this has been going on for quite some time. Now I can tell you that the presence of this cookie, that cookie is driven by the actors, the malicious actors. And so if another website is deploying the same cookie and using that unique name and leveraging these same websites, then it's fair to say that anyone who else is deploying this cookie is also malicious.
Okay, or compromised.
Yeah, so well, these are compromised web pages, but the domain of delivery is the one that sticks out to me as malicious. So static.travelclose.org, www.mentalhealthcheck.net, drivers.epsoncorp, U.S. travel brokers, and then, of course, our rssnbcpost.com. And so, to me, what's really interesting here is that, in looking at the full picture and explaining this, we kind of were able to weave together a story here using the data. Now, the actual story that took place is that the Russians compromised a number of embassy websites, and they were disguising their JavaScript source as initially Google Analytics. And so that was the first connection point that we had. Over time, they swapped out their command and controls, and they actually replaced the Google Analytics snippet with a clicky ID snippet.
Okay.
And that's where that clicky ID connection came from. And then, during the course of all this investigating, there was a number of security companies that began blogging about this infrastructure and posting how these websites were compromised. In doing so, they exposed a lot of the malicious infrastructure, and our crawlers naturally found that references to that information on these security websites. Mm-hmm. That's why we saw that in some of the overlap. But what they didn't account for was that cookie. That cookie of PMP sesh ID was never really mentioned in public. And as a result, we were able to continue tracking these malicious operators up until their final use of the infrastructure.
So with that single data set and pivot search, all that infrastructure is exposed.
Yeah, and it's important to note here that this is a great example that just comes together perfectly. But this was one that was a year and a half of following it and seeing it develop over a period of time. And that cookie was not something that was readily available to us right away. But fortunately, as that infrastructure got burned, it was yet another signal that we could leverage at our disposal to make a connection to all the malicious infrastructure. So a very cool example of using our crawling data sets and how the overlap was showed us a lot of different ways of compromised websites and ongoing operations.
To bring the whole picture into perspective from all of those traditional data sets, but then leveraging the crawling infrastructure that we have to create those new advanced data sets, derived data sets, we're able to link these sites together in a way that
we wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah.
So that was a great example.
Mm-hmm.